The steam from Eleanor's chamomile tea curled upward in the morning light, creating delicate spirals that seemed to mock the heaviness settling in her chest. Across the breakfast table, Harold sat with his newspaper folded precisely in thirds, the way he had every morning for 45 years. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking time that suddenly felt borrowed. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, not from age, but from the weight of words that still hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet kitchen. When he finally looked up from his paper, his gray eyes held no warmth, no recognition of the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, his entire adult life. The words that came next would fracture everything Eleanor thought she knew about their marriage, about herself, about the life she had so carefully built around loving him. "Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and final, "I need you to know something. You ruined my life. 45 years of marriage, and I can honestly say you destroyed every chance I had at happiness." The teacup slipped from Eleanor's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor she had mopped every Tuesday for 4 decades. But she didn't look down at the broken porcelain. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Harold's face, searching for any sign that these words weren't real, weren't final, weren't the end of everything she had believed about their love story. Eleanor Whitmore had always prided herself on being unshakable. At 72, she was the kind of woman who could host Thanksgiving dinner for 23 people without breaking a sweat, who remembered every grandchild's birthday and favorite color, who could stitch a torn dress or mend a broken heart with equal skill. She was 5 feet 4 inches of pure determination wrapped in cardigans and sensible shoes. With silver hair she still curled every Sunday night, and hands that never seemed to stop moving, cooking, cleaning, creating, caring for everyone except herself. But sitting in her kitchen that Tuesday morning in October, surrounded by the cheerful yellow walls she had painted 3 springs ago, and the collection of ceramic roosters she had been accumulating since her wedding day, Eleanor felt something inside her crack like ice on a warming pond. Harold's words echoed in the sudden silence, each syllable finding its target with surgical precision. She had been married to Harold Whitmore for 45 years, 2 months and 16 days. She could calculate it down to the hours if pressed, because Eleanor was the kind of woman who remembered anniversaries, not just their wedding day, but the first time he kissed her on the steps of the Riverside Public Library, the day he proposed during a thunderstorm on Miller's Peak, the morning he came home from his deployment overseas and lifted her off her feet in their tiny apartment kitchen. She remembered everything about their love story except, apparently, the moment it ended. Harold stood up from the table, his 6-foot frame still imposing despite the slight stoop age had given his shoulders. He folded his newspaper with the same methodical precision he brought to everything in his life, placed it on the counter next to the coffee maker, and walked toward the hallway. He moved like a man who had just delivered weather forecast, casual and detached, as if he hadn't just detonated 45 years of marriage with 23 carefully chosen words. "Harold," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. "What do you mean?" He paused at the doorway, his back still to her, his hand resting on the frame where their family photos lined the wall in perfect chronological order. Pictures of their wedding day, Harold in his navy dress blues, and Eleanor in her grandmother's altered wedding dress. Photos of their children, Michael taking his first steps, Sarah in her high school graduation cap, both of them with their own families now, scattered across 3 states and busy with lives that rarely intersected with this quiet house on Maple Street anymore. "I mean exactly what I said," Harold replied without turning around. 45 years of compromise, 45 years of settling, 45 years of pretending this was what I wanted. He paused, and Eleanor held her breath, hoping for some softening, some indication that this was a cruel joke or a moment of temporary madness. Instead, his voice grew colder. "I should have left years ago. I should have been brave enough to admit that marrying you was the biggest mistake of my life." Eleanor's hands found the edge of the table, gripping it so tightly her knuckles went white. The kitchen around her seemed to blur at the edges, as if she were looking through water. Everything looked the same. The green checked curtains she had sewn herself, the matching salt and pepper shakers shaped like tiny lighthouses that Harold had brought back from their anniversary trip to Maine, the magnetic poetry words scattered across the refrigerator door that their granddaughter had played with during her last visit. But nothing felt the same. Nothing would ever feel the same again. "I don't understand," she managed, though part of her was beginning to understand more than she wanted to. "Harold, what's brought this on? Have I done something? Said something? If there's a problem, we can talk about it. We can work through it like we always have." Harold finally turned around, and the look on his face was worse than his words had been. It was the expression of a man looking at a stranger, someone whose presence he tolerated but didn't particularly enjoy. There was no anger in his eyes, no passion, no fire, just a cold indifference that cut deeper than rage ever could. "That's the problem, Eleanor. You always want to fix things, to talk things through, to make everything better. But some things can't be fixed. Some mistakes are too big to undo." He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, a gesture she had seen thousands of times before, but which now seemed foreign, performed by a man she didn't recognize. "I'm 74 years old. I don't have time to pretend anymore." Eleanor stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was still wearing her mourning robe, the blue one with tiny flowers that Harold had given her 3 Christmases ago. At the time, she had treasured it because he had picked it out himself, had noticed that her old robe was fraying at the sleeves and had taken the initiative to replace it. Now she wondered if he had been trying to fix her even then, to replace something worn and unsightly with something more acceptable. "Pretend about what?" she asked, though her voice was growing stronger now, fueled by something that felt like anger, but tasted like heartbreak. "Pretend about our marriage? Our family? Pretend about loving me?" Harold's silence was answer enough. Eleanor walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the backyard they had landscaped together over decades of spring weekends. The oak tree Harold had planted the year Michael was born now towered over the fence, its leaves just beginning to turn the brilliant oranges and reds that had always been her favorite part of autumn. The garden beds she tended every morning were still blooming with the late-season flowers she had carefully selected to extend beauty deep into October. Chrysanthemums and asters and ornamental kale that would survive the first frost. She had built this life plant by plant, room by room, day by day. She had chosen paint colors and arranged furniture and hung pictures and planted seeds with the absolute certainty that she was creating something permanent, something beautiful, something worth the investment of her whole heart. She had never considered that Harold might have been merely tolerating the garden while secretly wishing for a different landscape entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How long?" she asked, her breath fogging the glass. "How long have you felt this way? Does it matter?" Harold's voice came from behind her, and she could hear him moving around the kitchen, probably putting his coffee cup in the dishwasher, following the morning routine that had become as natural as breathing, long enough to know it's not going to change. Eleanor turned around, and for a moment, she saw Harold the way she always had, as the young sailor who had swept her off her feet at a USO dance in 1978, as the determined young man who had worked 2 jobs to save for a house, as the father who had stayed up all night when the children were sick, as the husband who had held her hand during her surgery 2 years ago and promised everything would be all right. But that image flickered and faded like a mirage. replaced by this stranger who looked at her with tired eyes and spoke of their marriage like a prison sentence he had finally decided to escape. "I need some air," Harold said, reaching for his jacket from the hook by the back door. "I'm going to walk down to Henderson's store, maybe stop by the diner for lunch. Don't wait for me." Eleanor watched him go, noting absently that he didn't kiss her goodbye, didn't ask if she needed anything from the store, didn't suggest she join him for lunch the way he might have just yesterday. The back door closed with a soft click, and Eleanor was alone in the kitchen she had designed to be the heart of their home, surrounded by 45 years of shared memories that Harold had just declared worthless. She stood there for a long time, listening to the grandfather clock count the minutes, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight that streamed through windows she had washed just last week. Gradually, her shock began to crystallize into something sharper, more focused. Eleanor Whitmore had never been the type of woman to fall apart completely, even when her world was crumbling around her. She walked upstairs to their bedroom, her feet silent on the carpeted steps Harold had installed himself 15 years ago when his knees started bothering him. Their bedroom was exactly as she had left it that morning. Bed made with hospital corners, Harold's reading glasses folded neatly on his nightstand next to the biography of Theodore Roosevelt he had been working through for the past month, her own book tucked under her pillow along with the small leather journal she had been writing in since their first anniversary. Eleanor pulled the journal from its hiding place and held it in her hands. It was brown leather, worn soft from years of handling, with a small brass lock that had long since broken. She had filled dozens of journals over the years, each one documenting not just the events of their marriage, but her private thoughts, her hopes, her fears, her growing awareness of the slow changes in Harold's behavior toward her. She had never intended for anyone else to read these journals. They were her private sanctuary, the place where she could be completely honest about the small hurts and large disappointments that she never felt she could share with Harold directly. Over the years, as her friends had divorced or been widowed, as her children had grown up and moved away, as her world had gradually narrowed to just her and Harold and this house, the journals had become her closest confidants. Eleanor opened to a random page, dated 3 years earlier, and read her own handwriting. "Harold forgot our anniversary again today. I had made his favorite dinner and bought a bottle of the wine we shared on our honeymoon, but he came home, late from the hardware store, and seemed surprised when I mentioned the date. He apologized and said we could celebrate over the weekend, but we never did. I wonder sometimes if he remembers why he married me, or if I've become just another piece of furniture in his life, useful but unremarkable." She flipped forward several pages. "Harold criticized my driving again today, in front of the Hendersons at the grocery store. He said I take too long to make decisions and hold up traffic. Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed for me. I don't understand why he needs to point out my flaws to other people. It makes me feel small and foolish, like a child being scolded in public." And another entry from just 6 months ago. "I suggested we take a trip to visit Sarah and the grandchildren for Easter, but Harold said it was too much trouble and too expensive. Then I overheard him telling Jim Morrison that he might drive down to Florida to see the spring training games with his brother. When I asked about it, he said that was different, that it was just for a few days and didn't involve all the complications of visiting family. I didn't point out that I handle all the complications, the packing, the planning, the coordination with Sarah's schedule. I just nodded and said I understood." Page after page, year after year, Eleanor had documented a marriage that was slowly dying from 1,000 small cuts. Not dramatic fights or obvious betrayals, but a gradual erosion of respect and affection that had been so subtle she had almost convinced herself she was imagining it. Harold had never been cruel, never raised his voice or his hand, never cheated or lied about anything important. He had simply stopped seeing her as a person worth considering, worth consulting, worth cherishing. Eleanor closed the journal and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of all those unspoken truths. For 45 years, she had been the keeper of their family's emotional temperature, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for Harold's increasing distance. She had told herself that all marriages went through phases, that the passion of youth naturally evolved into the companionship of old age, that she was lucky to have a stable, predictable life when so many of her friends had endured divorces and heartbreak. But Harold's words this morning had stripped away all her rationalizations and forced her to see their marriage clearly for the first time. She hadn't been building a life with a partner who loved her. She had been performing the role of devoted wife for an audience of one who had stopped appreciating the show years ago. Eleanor walked to the bedroom window and looked out at Harold's retreating figure as he made his way down Maple Street toward the commercial district. He walked with purpose, like a man who had finally freed himself from a burden he had been carrying too long. There was something almost jaunty in his step, and Eleanor realized with a sharp pain in her chest that he looked happier than she had seen him in years. She thought about the life she had built around loving Harold Whitmore. She had given up her job at the library when Michael was born and had never gone back, despite her degree in education and her love of books. She had moved to his hometown instead of staying near her own family. She had learned to cook his favorite foods, had decorated their home according to his preferences, had scheduled their social life around his interests and his friends. She had become an expert at reading his moods and anticipating his needs, at making herself useful and undemanding, and pleasant. And for what? So that he could stand in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning and tell her she had ruined his life? Eleanor opened her jewelry box and pulled out her wedding ring, a simple gold band that Harold had bought with his Navy pay 2 weeks before their wedding. She had worn it every day for 45 years, had it resized twice as her fingers changed. With age, had it cleaned and polished annually at the jewelry store downtown. She held it up to the light, watching it catch the morning sun, and tried to remember the last time Harold had noticed she was wearing it. She couldn't. Eleanor slipped the ring into her pocket and walked to her closet. For the first time in years, she bypassed the practical clothes, the comfortable slacks and sensible blouses and cardigans that made up her daily uniform, and reached for a dress she hadn't worn in months. It was deep purple, Harold's least favorite color on her, which he had mentioned every time she wore it until she had finally stopped trying. Today, she put it on anyway. As Eleanor brushed her silver hair and applied lipstick for the first time in weeks, she caught sight of herself in the vanity mirror Harold had given her for their 10th anniversary. The woman looking back at her was older than she felt, with lines around her eyes and a softness around her jaw that spoke of 7 decades of living. But there was something else in her reflection, something she hadn't seen in years, a spark of defiance, a flicker of the young woman who had once dreamed of traveling the world and writing poetry and making a difference in people's lives. That woman had been buried under years of compromise and accommodation, of putting everyone else's needs before her own, of shrinking herself to fit into the shape Harold needed her to be. But she was still there, Eleanor realized, still breathing, still hoping, still capable of more than keeping house and tending garden and pretending that a marriage built on one person's sacrifice was sustainable. Eleanor picked up her journal and held it like a shield against her chest. Harold thought he had delivered the final word on their marriage this morning, had written the ending to their story with his casual cruelty. But Eleanor had been writing their story for 45 years, documenting every moment of joy and sorrow, every small victory and quiet defeat. She knew things about their marriage that Harold had forgotten or chosen to ignore, understood patterns he had never bothered to examine. Harold thought she had ruined his life, but Eleanor was beginning to suspect that she had ruined her own life trying to save a marriage that had been dying for years. The difference was that her life wasn't over yet. At 72, she still had time to write a different ending, to become the woman she had put aside when she said "I do" in the small church in Harold's hometown all those years ago. Eleanor walked downstairs and through the kitchen where the shattered teacup still lay on the floor. She left it there, stepped carefully around the pieces, and walked out the front door into the crisp October morning. For the first time in years, she didn't worry about what Harold would think when he came home and found the mess. She didn't leave a note explaining where she was going or when she would be back. She simply walked away from the life that had become too small to hold her, carrying nothing but her journal and the growing certainty that Harold Whitmore had just done her the greatest favor of her life, even if he would never know it. Eleanor walked for 3 hours that first day, her feet carrying her through neighborhoods she had lived near but never truly explored. The purple dress felt strange against her skin, foreign after months of practical clothing chosen for comfort rather than beauty. She passed houses she had driven by countless times but never really seen, noticed gardens planted by other women her age who had made different choices about color and texture and seasonal timing. The town of Riverside had grown around her over the decades, but Eleanor realized she had stopped paying attention to its evolution somewhere along the way. New shops had opened on Main Street, old buildings had been renovated, young families had moved into starter homes while elderly residents had downsized or moved to assisted living facilities. Life had continued its natural progression while Eleanor had remained fixed in patterns established decades earlier, as if marriage had frozen her in amber. When she finally returned home that evening, Harold was sitting in his recliner watching the evening news, a frozen dinner balanced on the TV tray beside him. He glanced up when she entered, his eyes taking in her purple dress and the flush in her cheeks from hours of walking, but he said nothing. No questions about where she had been, no concern about her absence, no acknowledgement that she looked different somehow, more alive than she had in years. "There are leftover meatballs in the refrigerator," Eleanor said, hanging her coat in the front closet. "I made them yesterday." "I managed," Harold replied, his attention already returning to the television where a meteorologist was predicting rain for the weekend. Eleanor went upstairs to change clothes, but instead of putting on her usual evening attire of comfortable slacks and a soft sweater, she selected a pair of dark jeans she hadn't worn in 2 years and a burgundy blouse Harold had once said made her look like she was trying too hard. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Eleanor tried to remember when she had started dressing to please Harold rather than herself, when his opinions had become more important than her own preferences. That night, she retrieved one of her older journals from the cedar chest at the foot of their bed and began reading entries from their early years of marriage. The contrast was startling. In 1979, newly married and living in their first apartment, she had written, "Harold surprised me with tickets to see the symphony tonight. I wore my blue dress, the one that makes me feel elegant, and he told me I was the most beautiful woman in the room. We held hands during the entire performance, and afterward we walked along the riverfront talking about everything and nothing. I feel so lucky to have found someone who sees the world the way I do." But by 1985, after Michael was born and they had bought their house on Maple Street, the tone had shifted subtly. "Harold has been working such long hours at the accounting firm. I know he's trying to provide for us, but I miss our conversations. When he comes home, he's tired and wants quiet. I've started writing letters to my sister instead of sharing my thoughts with him. Maybe this is just what marriage becomes when real life sets in." By 1992, when Sarah was in elementary school and Michael was a moody teenager, Eleanor's entries revealed a growing sense of isolation. "I suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us, while the children are at my mother's. Harold said, we couldn't afford it right now, but then he bought a new set of golf clubs the following week. I didn't mention the contradiction. I'm learning to keep my disappointments to myself." The pattern became clearer as Eleanor read through year after year of carefully documented small hurts. Harold hadn't suddenly stopped loving her this morning. He had been withdrawing his attention and affection gradually, so slowly that she had adapted to each new level of emotional distance without recognizing the cumulative effect. She had been like a frog in slowly heating water, adjusting to rising temperatures until she found herself in a marriage that would have been unrecognizable to her younger self. Eleanor closed the journal and walked to the bedroom window. Harold was in the backyard, checking the latches on the garden shed in his methodical way, preparing for the storm that was supposed to arrive over the weekend. He moved with the efficiency of a man completing a necessary task, not the care of someone tending to a space he loved. Eleanor realized she couldn't remember the last time Harold had shown genuine enthusiasm for anything related to their home, their life together, or her. The next morning, Harold left early for his weekly breakfast with his brother Thomas, a tradition that had started when Thomas retired 5 years earlier. Eleanor had been invited exactly once and had felt so obviously unwelcome that she had never asked to join them again. She spent the morning in her garden, pulling weeds and cutting back perennials for winter, but her mind kept drifting to conversations she had overheard between Harold and Thomas over the years. She remembered standing in the kitchen 2 summers, Iggo, preparing lemonade for Harold to take outside where the brothers sat on the patio, discussing local politics and their shared memories of childhood. Through the open window, she had heard Thomas ask Harold about retirement plans. "Eleanor wants to travel," Harold had said, his voice carrying the kind of weary resignation usually reserved for discussing unpleasant medical procedures. "She's got this idea about visiting Europe, seeing the places her grandmother used to tell stories about." "Sounds expensive," Thomas had replied. "And exhausting," Harold had added. "At our age, I'd rather stay home and enjoy what we've built here. But you know Eleanor, once she gets an idea in her head, she doesn't let go easily." Eleanor had frozen in the kitchen, the pitcher of lemonade forgotten in her hands. Harold had made her sound like a demanding child rather than a wife with dreams of her own, someone whose desires were burdensome rather than worthy of consideration. She had never mentioned the European trip again, had quietly canceled the travel magazines she had been collecting, had stopped pointing out newspaper articles about seniors who were exploring the world in their retirement years. Now, kneeling in the garden soil with dirt under her fingernails and autumn sun warming her shoulders, Eleanor tried to calculate how many dreams she had abandoned to avoid seeming demanding or unrealistic. The travel plans, yes, but also smaller things. The pottery classes she had wanted to take at the community center, the book club she had considered joining, the volunteer position at the animal shelter that had interested her until Harold pointed out how much time it would require. One by one, she had trimmed away pieces of herself to avoid conflict, to maintain peace, to keep Harold comfortable. She had told herself this was what love looked like in a long marriage: compromise, accommodation, putting the partnership ahead of individual desires. But Harold hadn't been making similar sacrifices. He still played golf twice a week with his friends. He still bought books he wanted to read, tools he thought he needed, small luxuries that caught his attention. He still made plans with Thomas without consulting her, still changed television channels without asking if she was watching, still made decisions about their social calendar based solely on his own preferences. Eleanor had been doing all the compromising while Harold had been living exactly the life he wanted, free from the burden of considering anyone else's needs or desires. That afternoon, while Harold napped in his recliner, Eleanor drove to the public library for the first time in months. She had always loved the library, had spent countless hours there during her working years helping patrons find books and resources, organizing community events, creating displays that would inspire people to discover new authors or topics. After she retired, she had continued visiting regularly until Harold started complaining about her frequent absences from home. "You spend more time at that library than you do here," he had said one evening when she returned home, energized from a lecture about local history. "I don't understand what you find so fascinating about other people's old books when you have plenty to read right here." Eleanor had tried to explain the joy of discovering new ideas, the pleasure of conversations with other readers, the satisfaction of helping someone find exactly the book they needed. But Harold had looked at her with the patient expression he might use with a child explaining an imaginary friend. so she had gradually reduced her visits to occasional quick trips for specific books, always making sure to return home before. Harold noticed her absence. Now, walking through the familiar stacks and breathing in the scent of paper and possibility, Eleanor felt a loosening in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. She wandered through sections she had neglected, pulled books from shelves based on whim rather than purpose, allowed herself to become lost in the simple pleasure of following her curiosity wherever it led. In the travel section, she found a book about women who had traveled alone after age 70, their photographs showing faces marked by adventure and confidence. Eleanor studied their stories, reading about widows and divorcees who had decided that age was not a barrier to exploration, that independence could be learned at any stage of life. She checked out 6 books, an act of rebellion that would have seemed laughable to an outside observer, but felt revolutionary to Eleanor. Harold would notice the stack of books, would probably comment on the expense of library fines if she didn't return them promptly, would make some remark about her inability to stick to one topic or genre. For 45 years, she had anticipated and tried to prevent such criticism. Today, she decided she didn't care what Harold thought about her reading choices. Eleanor spent the evening in the living room, a book open in her lap, while Harold watched a documentary about World War II battleships. They sat 3 feet apart on the same sofa where they had once snuggled together during movies, where they had read bedtime stories to their children, where they had held each other during the difficult period after Harold's father died. Now, they might as well have been strangers sharing a waiting room, each absorbed in separate activities with no expectation of interaction. During a commercial break, Harold glanced at the cover of Eleanor's book, a memoir by a woman who had hiked the Appalachian Trail at age 75. Why would anyone want to read about some old lady wandering around in the woods? He asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. Eleanor looked up from the page where the author was describing the moment she realized that her fear of sleeping alone in a tent was nothing compared to her fear of living the rest of her life without challenge or discovery. I find her courage inspiring, Eleanor replied. She decided she wanted an adventure, and she didn't let age or inexperience stop her. Harold snorted. Sounds like a good way to get yourself killed. There's a reason people settle down when they get older instead of chasing around the countryside like teenagers. Eleanor marked her place in the book and studied Harold's profile. When had he become so dismissive of possibility, so certain that aging meant narrowing rather than expanding? The Harold she had married had talked about sailing around the world. When he retired from the Navy, had dreamed of building a cabin in the mountains where they could spend summers hiking and fishing and watching wildlife. What happened to the cabin you wanted to build? Eleanor asked. You used to talk about that all the time when the children were young. Harold's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his features, before settling back into familiar irritation. That was a young man's fantasy, he said. People grow up. They realize that dreams are expensive and impractical. We've got a perfectly good house right here, paid for and maintained. Why would we want to complicate our lives with another property to worry about? But Eleanor remembered more than Harold's dreams about the cabin. She remembered the weekend trips they had taken to look at land, the evenings spent sketching floor plans and debating the merits of different locations, the way Harold's eyes had lit up when he talked about waking up to mountain views and falling, asleep to the sound of a nearby stream. She remembered how excited she had been about the project, how she had researched solar panels and composting toilets and wood-burning stoves, how they had planned to make it an adventure they would share. The cabin dream had died sometime in the early 1990s, around the time Harold's accounting practice had grown busy enough to consume most of his attention and energy. Eleanor had assumed they were just postponing the plan until Harold's workload became more manageable, until the children finished college, until they had more financial security. She had never realized that Harold had abandoned the dream entirely, had reclassified it as a youthful folly rather than a postponed goal. How many other dreams had Harold buried without telling her? How many plans had he discarded without discussion, leaving Eleanor to wonder why conversations about future adventures had gradually disappeared from their dinner table conversations? Over the following weeks, Eleanor began paying closer attention to Harold's patterns, documenting them in her journal with the same care she had once used to track the children's development milestones. She noticed that Harold checked his email and read news websites for at least 2 hours every morning, but had stopped asking Eleanor about her plans for the day. He maintained detailed knowledge about the stock market, local politics, and professional sports, but couldn't remember when Eleanor had last visited the dentist or whether she had enjoyed the book she had been reading the week before. Harold had strong opinions about the condition of their neighbor's lawn, the competence of various local officials, and the quality of service at the restaurants where they occasionally ate dinner, but he hadn't complimented Eleanor's cooking in months, and hadn't noticed when she had changed her hair color slightly or started wearing different jewelry. Most tellingly, Harold could recount in detail conversations he'd had with his brother, his golf partners, and acquaintances at the hardware store. But he rarely asked Eleanor about her interactions with friends or family. It was as if she had become invisible to him as a person with her own social world, her own opinions, her own experiences worth sharing and discussing. Eleanor began testing this theory in small ways. She mentioned to Harold that she was thinking about taking a watercolor painting class, but he responded with a distracted, "That's nice," while reading the newspaper. She told him that their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had fallen and broken her hip, information that prompted only a grunt of acknowledgement. She even mentioned that she had been having strange dreams lately, unusual for her, but Harold simply suggested she stop eating cheese before bedtime. Each failed attempt at meaningful conversation confirmed what Eleanor's journals had been documenting for years. Harold had stopped seeing her as an interesting person worthy of his attention. She had become background noise in his life, a familiar presence that required no engagement or curiosity. The realization might have been devastating if Eleanor hadn't also been rediscovering aspects of herself that existed independent of Harold's opinion. The books she checked out from the library introduced her to women who had reinvented themselves at every stage of life, who had pursued education and adventure and creative expression without seeking permission from husbands or children or society's expectations about appropriate behavior for elderly women. Eleanor started a new journal, one dedicated not to documenting disappointments but to exploring possibilities. She wrote about places she wanted to visit, classes she might take, volunteer opportunities that appealed to her, friendships she wanted to deepen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that looked different from her present, that included growth and change and discovery. She also began paying attention to other marriages among their friends and acquaintances, studying the dynamics between couples she had known for decades. At a dinner party hosted by their neighbors, the Clarksons, Eleanor watched how Bob Clarkson interrupted his wife Martha mid-sentence 3 times during dinner, how he corrected her version of a story they were telling about their recent vacation, how he answered questions that had been directed to Martha as if she were incapable of speaking for herself. But Eleanor also noticed that Martha pushed back in small ways, redirecting conversations that Bob had hijacked, making gentle corrections when he misremembered details, maintaining her own friendships and interests despite Bob's obvious preference for being the center of attention. Martha had found ways to preserve her identity within a marriage to a man who might have otherwise overwhelmed her completely. At the grocery store, Eleanor observed Helen Morrison, recently widowed, navigating the produce section with a confidence that seemed to have grown since her husband's death 6 months earlier. Helen had told Eleanor that she was learning to cook for one person after 40 years of meal planning for 2, but she spoke about the challenge with enthusiasm rather than sadness, as if discovering her own preferences was an unexpected gift rather than a burden. "I never realized how much I compromised about food," Helen had said, selecting vegetables that her husband would never have eaten. "Bill was such a meat and potatoes man that I forgot I actually love trying new cuisines. Last week I made Thai curry for the first time in my life, and it was delicious." Eleanor began experimenting with her own cooking, preparing dishes that appealed to her rather than defaulting to Harold's predictable preferences. She made spicy Indian dal that Harold declared too exotic, prepared elaborate salads with ingredients he dismissed as rabbit food, baked a lemon tart that he claimed was too sweet. Each meal became a small assertion of her own tastes, a quiet rebellion against decades of accommodation. Harold's complaints about her culinary experiments were predictable and increasingly easy to ignore. Eleanor realized that his criticism had power over her only as long as she believed his opinions were more valid than her own. As long as she accepted the premise that his comfort was more important than her creativity and growth. One evening, as Harold complained that her mushroom risotto was too rich and that he preferred his rice plain, Eleanor looked across the dinner table and saw not the love of her life, but a man who had grown comfortable treating her like a short-order cook, rather than a partner. The recognition wasn't painful anymore. It was clarifying. "Next time I'll make something you like better," Eleanor said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was lying. She had no intention of returning to the limited menu of Harold's preferences. No interest in shrinking her culinary world to accommodate his increasingly narrow palate. Harold nodded, satisfied that his complaint had been heard and acknowledged, apparently unaware that Eleanor's acquiescence was purely theoretical. He had grown so accustomed to her accommodation that he no longer recognized the difference between genuine agreement and polite dismissal. That night, Eleanor wrote in her new journal, "I have spent 45 years trying to become the woman Harold wanted me to be, but I never asked whether Harold was becoming the man I needed him to be. I changed myself to fit his expectations, while he remained exactly the same, growing more rigid and demanding with each passing year. I turned myself into a supporting character in his life story, but he never bothered to learn his role in mine." As autumn deepened and the first frost killed her garden annuals, Eleanor felt something awakening in herself that had been dormant for years. It wasn't anger, exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't sadness, though she grieved for the woman she had been before marriage taught her to edit herself. It was something stronger and more fundamental, a growing certainty that she deserved more than tolerance from the person who was supposed to love her most. Eleanor had always believed that marriage required sacrifice, that love meant putting someone else's needs ahead of your own, but she was beginning to understand that healthy sacrifice was mutual, that sustainable love required both partners to grow and change and support each other's evolution. Harold had expected her to do all the bending while he remained fixed in place, all the giving while he simply received. For 45 years, Eleanor had been trying to save a marriage by making herself smaller, quieter, more convenient. She had been afraid that demanding more would risk losing what she had, never considering that what she had might not be worth preserving. Now, watching Harold read his newspaper over breakfast without acknowledging her presence, Eleanor wondered what she had actually been afraid of losing. A man who found her company boring? A marriage that required her constant self-suppression? A life so predictable and narrow that adventure seemed threatening rather than exciting? Eleanor poured herself a second cup of coffee, something she rarely did, because Harold had once mentioned that caffeine made her jittery. As she savored the rich flavor and felt the pleasant buzz of alertness, she realized she wasn't jittery at all. She was energized. For the first time in years, Eleanor Whitmore was fully awake. The morning everything changed began like any other Tuesday in November. Eleanor woke at 6:30, as she had for decades, and padded downstairs in her slippers to start the coffee. Harold was already seated at the kitchen table, fully dressed in his pressed khakis and button-down shirt, reading yesterday's newspaper that he had apparently retrieved from the recycling bin. This was new behavior, this rereading of news he had already consumed, but Eleanor had stopped questioning Harold's increasingly peculiar habits. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee grounds and water, with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The familiar sounds of the coffee maker gurgling to life filled the silence between them. A mechanical conversation that had replaced the intimate morning talks they had once shared as young marrieds. Harold cleared his throat in the way that usually preceded a complaint or criticism. Eleanor braced herself, running through the possibilities. Had she forgotten to pick up his prescription? Left the porch light on too late? Failed to properly clean something to his exacting standards? "I've been thinking about what I said last month," Harold began, his voice carrying the tone he might use to discuss a minor household repair. "About our marriage being a mistake." Eleanor's hand stilled on the coffee cup she had been reaching for. They hadn't spoken directly about that morning since it happened, had simply continued their parallel lives as if those devastating words hadn't been uttered. She had begun to wonder if Harold had forgotten what he said, or if he expected her to pretend it never happened. "I want you to know I meant every word," Harold continued, methodically folding the newspaper into precise quarters. "But I've been thinking about the practical aspects of our situation. Divorce would be expensive and complicated at our age. There would be lawyers and paperwork and division of assets. The children would be upset and confused." Eleanor turned around slowly, studying Harold's face for any sign of emotion, any indication that he understood the weight of what he was discussing. His expression remained neutral, businesslike, as if he were outlining a home improvement project rather than dismantling 45 years of marriage. "So I've come to a decision," Harold said, setting the folded newspaper aside with characteristic precision. "We'll stay married on paper, but we'll live separate lives under the same roof. You can have your activities and interests, and I'll have mine. We'll be civil roommates rather than husband and wife. It's a practical solution that avoids the mess of divorce while acknowledging that our romantic relationship is over." The coffee maker finished its cycle with a final mechanical wheeze, the sound somehow amplifying the silence that followed Harold's announcement. Eleanor stared at him, trying to process what she had just heard. He had unilaterally redesigned. Their marriage without consultation had reduced their relationship to a business arrangement based on convenience and financial considerations. "You've decided this?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Without discussing it with me? Without asking what I might want?" Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, as if her question surprised him. "What's to discuss?" "This arrangement serves both our interests. You'll have your independence, and I'll have mine. We'll maintain the appearance of marriage for social purposes while living as we choose privately." Eleanor felt something break. Inside her chest, not with the sharp pain of a sudden injury, but with the dull ache of something that had been cracking under pressure for years, finally giving way completely. Harold had just confirmed what her journals had been documenting. He saw her not as a partner whose feelings and desires mattered, but as a problem to be managed with efficient solutions. "And what if I don't agree to your arrangement?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What if I want something different?" Harold looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Like what? You've got the house, your garden, your library books. You can take those art classes you've been mentioning, join whatever clubs you want. You'll have complete freedom to do as you please." "What if I want a husband who loves me?" Eleanor asked. "What if I want a marriage instead of a roommate situation? What if I want to matter to someone?" Harold's expression shifted to the patient exasperation he typically reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow children. "Eleanor, we're 72 and 74 years old. Romance is for young people. At our age, companionship and practical considerations are what matter. You're being unrealistic about what marriage looks like after nearly 5 decades." Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. She had expected Harold's proposal to devastate her, but instead she felt an odd sense of liberation. His clinical dismantling of their marriage had inadvertently given her permission to examine their relationship with the same dispassionate clarity. "You're right," she said, surprising Harold with her agreement. Romance might be for young people, but respect isn't. Consideration isn't. Kindness isn't. And I've been living without all three for longer than I care to admit. Harold frowned, clearly not expecting this response. I've always been respectful. I've never raised my voice to you or treated you badly. Eleanor sat down across from him at the table where they had shared thousands of meals, where they had helped their children with homework, where they had once planned their dreams and goals together. Now it felt like a negotiation table where they were discussing the terms of surrender. You haven't treated me badly in obvious ways, Eleanor agreed, but you've treated me like furniture for years. Present, functional, but not worth noticing or appreciating. You've dismissed my opinions, ignored my interests, and taken my efforts for granted. You've made me feel invisible in my own home. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I think you're being overly dramatic. All marriages settle into routines. People can't maintain the intensity of courtship forever. I'm not talking about intensity, Eleanor said. I'm talking about basic human decency. When was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? When did you last thank me for cooking a meal or managing our household or remembering your sister's birthday? When did you last treat me like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to you? Harold's silence stretched long enough to serve as an answer. Eleanor could see him searching his memory, trying to recall instances of the consideration she was describing, and finding nothing recent enough to cite as evidence. You want to live as roommates? Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, with each word. But even good roommates show more interest in each other's lives than you've shown in mine. They express gratitude for shared responsibilities, ask permission before making decisions that affect the household, consider each other's preferences when planning activities. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, Harold said, but his tone had lost some of its confidence. The arrangement I'm proposing gives us both what we want. It gives you what you want, Eleanor corrected. It allows you to keep the benefits of having a wife, someone to maintain the house, manage the social obligations, provide companionship when you want it, without any of the responsibilities of being a husband. You get to have your independence, while I continue to serve your needs. Harold stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, Eleanor. You used to be reasonable. You used to understand that marriage requires compromise and accommodation. I've been doing all the compromising, Eleanor said, remaining seated while Harold paced to the kitchen window. For 45 years, I've been accommodating your preferences, your schedule, your vision of what our life should look like. I've been so busy adapting to your needs that I forgot I had needs of my own. Harold turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of irritation and bewilderment. What needs? You have everything you could possibly want. A nice home, financial security, grown children, good health. What more could you need at your age? Eleanor looked at Harold standing by the window, backlit by the gray November morning, and realized that he genuinely couldn't comprehend what she was trying to tell him. In his worldview, material comfort and social status were sufficient for happiness. The idea that she might crave emotional intimacy, intellectual companionship, or romantic affection struck him as greedy and unrealistic. I need to feel valued, Eleanor said quietly. I need to matter to someone. I need to be seen as a complete person, not just as a collection of useful functions. I need to be loved, Harold, not just tolerated. Harold's expression hardened. You're 72 years old, Eleanor. You're not some young girl waiting for Prince Charming. This is real life, not a romance novel. The dismissiveness in his voice, the casual cruelty of reducing her desire for love to childish fantasy, broke something fundamental in Eleanor's relationship with the man she had devoted her entire adult life to pleasing. She had been willing to accept that their passion had cooled with age, that their relationship had evolved from romance to companionship. but she was not willing to accept that wanting basic human affection made her ridiculous. "You're right," Eleanor said, standing up and walking to the kitchen counter where her purse sat beside the fruit bowl she filled every Monday morning with apples Harold never ate. "I'm not some young girl. I'm a grown woman who has wasted far too many years trying to convince a man to love her." She pulled her car keys from her purse, noting absently that Harold didn't ask where she was going. Even in the middle of what should have been an important conversation about their future, he couldn't muster enough interest in her life to express curiosity about her plans. "I'm going to visit my sister," Eleanor said, though she hadn't spoken to Margaret in 6 months. "I'll be back when I'm ready to be back." Harold nodded curtly. "Fine. I'll pick up something for dinner." Eleanor paused at the back door, keys in hand, looking at Harold one more time. He had already dismissed her from his attention, had turned back to his newspaper as if their conversation had been a minor interruption rather than a watershed moment in their marriage. She realized that Harold probably considered their discussion finished, his practical solution proposed, and her emotional objections noted but ultimately irrelevant. "Harold," she said, causing him to glance up with obvious impatience. "When you think about the arrangement you've proposed, does it occur to you that I might want more from my life than being your unpaid housekeeper and occasional companion?" Harold's frown deepened. "What else would you want? You're not going to remarry at your age. You're not going to start some new career or run off on adventures. This is your life, Eleanor. This house, this town, this routine. My proposal simply acknowledges reality while making the best of our circumstances." Eleanor stared at Harold for a long moment, memorizing his face with its familiar lines and angles, the gray eyes that had once looked at her with desire and now regarded her with mild irritation. She was looking at a stranger who happened to share her last name, who had somehow convinced himself that his limited imagination represented the boundaries of possibility for everyone around him. "Maybe you're right," Eleanor said finally. "Maybe this is my life. But maybe I get to decide what to do with it." She walked out the back door without looking back, leaving Harold alone with his newspaper and his practical solutions and his absolute certainty that he understood what was best for everyone. Eleanor drove to Margaret's house in the neighboring town of Millfield, a 30-minute journey she had made countless times over the years, but which today felt like crossing into foreign territory. Margaret was 2 years younger and had been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband Frank died suddenly of a heart attack. The sisters had grown apart during the years when their children were young and their lives were consumed by the demands of motherhood. But Margaret's recent loss had renewed their connection somewhat. Margaret answered the door in paint-stained clothes, her gray hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, looking more relaxed and vibrant than Eleanor had seen her in years. The house smelled like turpentine and coffee, and classical music played softly from a radio in what had once been Frank's study. "Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise," Margaret said, pulling her sister into a warm hug. "I was just finishing up in my studio. Come in. Let me show you what I've been working on." Eleanor followed Margaret through the familiar house, noting the changes that had occurred since Frank's death. Walls that had once been covered with Frank's hunting trophies now displayed Margaret's watercolor paintings. The living room that had been dominated by Frank's enormous television and leather recliner now featured comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than passive entertainment. "I turned Frank's den into my art studio," Margaret explained, leading Eleanor into a sun-filled room lined with easels and art supplies. "I know it sounds terrible, but I feel more myself in this house now than I did in 40 years of marriage." Eleanor studied the paintings that covered every available surface: watercolors of local landscapes, still lifes of flowers and fruit, portraits of children and elderly people whose faces told stories of long lives fully lived. The work was sophisticated and confident, clearly the product of serious study and practice. "Margaret, these are beautiful," Eleanor said, genuinely moved by the talent her sister had apparently been developing in secret. "How long have you been painting?" Margaret laughed, wiping her hands on a paint-stained towel. I started taking classes about 5 years ago, while Frank was still alive. He thought it was a silly hobby, a waste of money, but I kept going anyway. After he died, I realized I could turn his study into a proper studio, could take advanced classes, could even sell a few pieces if I wanted to. Eleanor picked up a small canvas that showed a woman of middle age standing alone on a beach, her face turned toward the horizon with an expression of quiet determination. Something about the painting's mood resonated deeply, as if Margaret had somehow captured Eleanor's current emotional state in watercolor. "Is this how you felt after Frank died?" Eleanor asked. "Free, but uncertain?" Margaret joined Eleanor, in front of the painting, both sisters studying the solitary figure on the beach. "Yes and no," Margaret said thoughtfully. "I was sad about Frank's death, of course. We had 41 years together, and he wasn't a bad man. But I also felt relieved, in ways I hadn't expected. Relieved not to have to defend my choices, not to have to justify my interests, not to have to make myself smaller to accommodate his discomfort with anything that didn't directly serve his needs." Eleanor felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Margaret had just articulated feelings Eleanor hadn't been able to name, had given voice to the complex mixture of grief and liberation that had been building in Eleanor's chest for months. "Harold wants us to become roommates," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out before she could censor them. "He's decided our marriage is over romantically, but he wants to maintain the practical arrangement. Separate lives under the same roof." Margaret set down her paintbrush and gave Eleanor her full attention. "And what do you want?" The question, so simple and direct, caught Eleanor off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her what she wanted without immediately explaining why her desires were impractical or unrealistic? "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I know I don't want to be Harold's roommate and unpaid housekeeper. I know I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending that tolerance is the same thing as love. But I don't know what the alternative looks like." Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that sat on a small table beside her easel, and the sisters settled into comfortable chairs that faced the window overlooking Margaret's garden. The view was peaceful, carefully tended beds of late season, plants that would provide color and texture through the winter months. "When Frank died," Margaret said slowly, "I thought my life was essentially over. I was 69 years old, had been married since I was 25, had never lived alone or made major decisions independently. I was terrified of everything: managing finances, maintaining the house, figuring out how to fill my days without someone else's schedule to organize around." Eleanor nodded, recognizing similar fears in her own reluctance to imagine life without Harold. "But something interesting happened," Margaret continued. "Once I got past the initial panic, I started discovering aspects of myself that had been dormant for decades. I remembered that I had always loved art, had actually been quite good at drawing in high school before I got married and put aside childish pursuits. I remembered that I enjoyed classical music, which Frank had always dismissed as pretentious. I remembered that I liked cooking elaborate meals just for the creative challenge, not because someone expected dinner at precisely 6 o'clock. Margaret gestured around the converted studio, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I'm not saying Frank prevented me from pursuing these interests. I could have taken art classes while he was alive, could have played whatever music I wanted when he wasn't home. But his constant, subtle disapproval made everything feel like an act of rebellion rather than a natural expression of who I was." Eleanor understood exactly what Margaret meant. Harold had never explicitly forbidden her from pursuing her interests, but his dismissive comments and obvious irritation had made her own desires feel selfish and frivolous. She had internalized his perspective so completely that she had begun to see her own preferences through his critical eyes. "Do you ever regret not leaving Frank years ago?" Eleanor asked. "Do you wish you had been brave enough to choose yourself earlier?" Margaret considered the question carefully, her gaze focused on the garden where late afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the dormant flower beds. "I think about that sometimes," she said finally. "I wonder who I might have become if I had been willing to disappoint people, to risk criticism, to prioritize my own growth and happiness. But I also know that I wasn't ready to make those choices 20 or 30 years ago. I needed to reach a point where the pain of staying the same became greater than the fear of change." Eleanor sipped her coffee and felt something loosening. In her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Margaret's honesty was giving her permission to examine her own situation without the guilt and shame that usually accompanied thoughts of leaving Harold. "Harold thinks I should be grateful for what I have," Eleanor said. "A nice house, financial security, grown children. He thinks wanting more at my age is unrealistic and selfish." Margaret laughed, but not unkindly. "Harold thinks that because it serves his interests for you to believe that. If you're content with the basics, he doesn't have to put any effort into making you happy. He doesn't have to consider your feelings or accommodate your needs or grow as a person himself." The sisters talked until well past dinner time, sharing stories and observations that had been accumulating for years. Margaret showed Eleanor her art supplies, explained different watercolor techniques, encouraged her to try painting a simple landscape. Eleanor discovered that she had a natural sense of color and composition, that the act of translating what she saw into brushstrokes was deeply satisfying in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You should take a class," Margaret suggested, as Eleanor cleaned her brush after completing a small painting of the view from the studio window. "There's a wonderful teacher at the community center who works with beginners. Very encouraging, not intimidating at all." Eleanor studied her small watercolor, imperfect but recognizably her own creation, and felt a spark of pride she hadn't experienced in years. The painting wasn't sophisticated or technically accomplished, but it was entirely hers, created purely, for the joy of making something beautiful. "Harold would think it's a waste of time and money?" Eleanor said automatically, then caught herself. "But maybe that doesn't matter anymore." Margaret smiled knowingly. "That's the beginning of wisdom, Eleanor, realizing that other people's opinions of your choices are none of your business." When Eleanor finally drove home that evening, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and Harold had already gone to bed. She found a note on the kitchen counter informing her that he had eaten a frozen dinner and would appreciate it if she would give him advance notice of her absences in the future so he could plan accordingly. The note was signed H. Whitmore, as if they were business associates rather than husband and wife. Eleanor crumpled the note and threw it in the trash can, a small act of defiance that felt disproportionately satisfying. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with her journal, writing about her afternoon with Margaret, about the unexpected pleasure of painting, about the growing certainty that Harold's version of their future was not the only possibility. As she wrote, Eleanor became aware of sounds from upstairs. Harold's television, the floorboards creaking as he moved around their bedroom, the sound of water running in the bathroom sink. These were the sounds of Harold's evening routine, as predictable and familiar as her own breathing. For 45 years, she had synchronized her schedule with his, had made her bedtime dependent on his schedule, had treated his preferences as family law. Tonight, she stayed downstairs until she felt genuinely tired, not merely ready to accommodate Harold's routine. She brushed her teeth in the downstairs powder room instead of the master bathroom, avoiding the need to tiptoe around Harold's preparations for sleep. When she finally went upstairs, Harold was snoring softly, oblivious to her late arrival. Eleanor changed into her nightgown quietly, but not with the exaggerated care she usually employed to avoid disturbing Harold. If her movements woke him, she decided he could adjust his sleep schedule to accommodate her needs for once. She slipped into bed with her journal and a small reading light Harold had always claimed kept him awake, and continued writing until she felt ready for sleep. The next morning, Harold was already dressed and reading his newspaper when Eleanor came downstairs. He glanced up with obvious irritation when she entered the kitchen. "You were very late last night," he said. "I had to get my own dinner and figure out the dishwasher settings myself." Eleanor poured herself coffee and began preparing toast, noting that Harold had apparently mastered the dishwasher controls he had been claiming to find confusing for the past 3 years. "I visited Margaret," Eleanor said. "I told you that yesterday morning." "You didn't mention you would be gone all day," Harold replied. "It's inconsiderate to leave me without any idea when you'll be back." Eleanor turned to face Harold, studying his expression of genuine indignation. He was not joking or exaggerating for effect. He was genuinely upset that she had spent an afternoon with her sister without providing him with a detailed itinerary and estimated time of return. "Harold," Eleanor said carefully, "I'm a 72-year-old woman, not a teenager with a curfew. I don't need your permission to visit my sister, and I don't owe you a minute-by-minute account of my whereabouts." Harold's frown deepened. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about common courtesy. If you're going to be away, I need to know so I can plan accordingly." "Plan what exactly?" Eleanor asked. "What did my absence prevent you from doing yesterday that required advance planning?" Harold's silence revealed that her absence had inconvenienced him only in the sense that he had been forced to take minimal responsibility for his own meals and entertainment. He had functioned perfectly well without her, had simply resented being expected to do so. "Margaret is taking watercolor painting classes," Eleanor said, changing the subject before Harold could formulate a defense of his position. "She's become quite good. I'm thinking about enrolling in the beginner's class at the community center." Harold looked up from his newspaper with the expression of weary patience he typically reserved for listening to telemarketers or political advertisements. Painting classes? At your age? Eleanor, you've never shown any artistic ability. It seems like an expensive way to discover you don't have a talent for something." Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always accompanied Harold's. Casual dismissal of her interests, but today the feeling was accompanied by something new. A clear-eyed recognition of what Harold was doing and why. "Maybe I'll discover I do have talent," Eleanor said. "Or maybe I'll simply enjoy the process of learning something new. Either way, it will be my time and my money to spend as I choose." Harold's expression shifted to the concerned puzzlement he might display when observing erratic behavior in an elderly neighbor. "I think you're going through some kind of phase," he said. "Maybe you should talk to Dr. Peterson about hormone therapy or antidepressants. This sudden interest in independence and new activities isn't like you." Eleanor stared at Harold across the breakfast table, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. He wasn't concerned about her well-being. He was concerned about the inconvenience her growing independence might cause him. He preferred the version of Eleanor who sought his approval, who deferred to his judgment, who made his comfort her primary concern. "You're right," Eleanor said. "This isn't like me. The old me would have accepted your practical roommate arrangement and spent the rest of my life making myself useful to you while pretending I didn't need anything more than basic survival. But the old me was afraid of disappointing people. The old me thought being needed was the same thing as being loved." Eleanor picked up her coffee cup and her journal and walked toward the kitchen door. "The new me," she said without looking back, "is more interested in being happy than in being useful." Harold called after her, his voice carrying a note of panic Eleanor had never heard before. "Eleanor, where are you going? We need to discuss this rationally." Eleanor paused at the doorway and turned back to face Harold one more time. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than the man who had been making unilateral decisions about their future just 24 hours earlier. "We've been discussing this for 45 years, Harold. You just haven't been listening." Eleanor walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to their bedroom, where she pulled her suitcase from the closet and began, for the second time in her adult life, to pack for an uncertain future. This time, however, she wasn't running away from something she couldn't bear. She was running toward something she had never dared to imagine possible. A life where her happiness mattered as much as everyone else's. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom at Margaret's house, her suitcase resting on the floral comforter that had belonged to their mother decades earlier. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old books, a combination that reminded Eleanor of childhood summers spent at their grandmother's cottage by the lake. She had arrived at Margaret's door 3 hours earlier, rain-soaked and trembling. Not from cold, but from the magnitude of what she had just done. She had left Harold sitting at the breakfast table with his newspaper and his practical solutions, had walked upstairs and packed 2 weeks' worth of clothing, toiletries, and the stack of journals that represented 45 years of documented marriage. She had written a brief note explaining that she needed time to think and would be staying with Margaret indefinitely, then placed her wedding ring on Harold's nightstand where he would be sure to find it. The note had been more difficult to write than the packing. Eleanor had started and discarded a dozen versions, struggling to find words that expressed her feelings without descending into bitterness or blame. In the end, she had settled on simple honesty. Harold, I cannot accept your proposal to become roommates. I need to remember who I am when I'm not trying to be the woman you want me to be. I will contact you when I'm ready to discuss our future. She had signed it Eleanor Whitmore, rather than Love Eleanor, or even Your Wife Eleanor. The formal signature felt like a small declaration of independence, a signal that she was no longer willing to automatically position herself as Harold's devoted spouse. Margaret had asked no questions when Eleanor appeared at her door with suitcase. In hand and rain dripping from her gray hair, she had simply helped carry Eleanor's belongings upstairs, made a pot of strong tea, and settled them both in the converted art studio where late afternoon light filtered through rain-streaked windows. Now, as evening approached and Eleanor arranged her few possessions in the guest room, she felt the peculiar mixture of terror and exhilaration that accompanies any leap into the unknown. At 72, Eleanor had never lived anywhere but with family. She had moved from her parents' house to married student housing with Harold, then to their first apartment, and eventually to the house on Maple Street where they had raised their children and grown old together. She had never paid her own bills, never made major decisions without consulting someone else, never woken up in the morning without knowing exactly what was expected of her that day. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Margaret appeared in the doorway carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was working hard not to say, "I told you so," or "It's about time." "I thought we might need this," Margaret said, setting the wine on the small table by the window. "It's been quite a day." Eleanor accepted a glass of wine gratefully, noting that it was a variety she had never tried before, something Harold would have declared too sweet or too expensive, or simply too different from the predictable brands he preferred. The wine was actually quite good, with a complexity that revealed itself slowly as she sipped. "I can't remember the last time I had wine on a Tuesday evening," Eleanor said, settling into the comfortable chair that faced Margaret's easel. Harold always said alcohol on weeknights was a sign of poor self-discipline. Margaret raised her glass in a mock toast. "Here's to poor self-discipline and Tuesday evening wine, then." Frank used to say the same thing, right up until the day he died with a beer in his hand while watching Monday Night Football. The sisters laughed, and Eleanor felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She had been carrying herself like someone walking a tightrope, afraid that any sudden movement might send her tumbling back into the life she had just escaped. "Margaret," Eleanor said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, "do you think I'm being selfish? Leaving Harold when we're both too old to start over completely?" Margaret studied Eleanor's face in the fading light, her artist's eyes taking in details that a casual observer might miss. Eleanor had always been the prettier sister, with delicate features and naturally wavy hair that had aged to an elegant silver. But Margaret could see lines of tension around Eleanor's eyes, a tightness in her jaw that spoke of years of biting back words and swallowing disappointments. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that you're being realistic. You're facing the fact that staying in a loveless marriage won't become easier or more bearable just because you're getting older. If anything, it will become harder as you have. Fewer distractions and more time to think about what you've settled for." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in her sister's words. The years when she had been busy with child-rearing and career-building and community obligations had provided buffer against the growing emptiness in her marriage. Now that their social circle had shrunk with age and their children lived independent lives scattered across the country, the fundamental incompatibility between Eleanor and Harold had become impossible to ignore. "I keep thinking about all the things I gave up," Eleanor said. "Not just the big dreams like travel or going back to school, but small daily pleasures. I stopped listening to jazz because Harold said it gave him headaches. I stopped cooking ethnic foods because he called them too spicy or too weird. I stopped wearing bright colors because he said they made me look like I was trying too hard." Margaret leaned forward, setting her wine glass aside. "Eleanor, do you even remember what you like anymore? When was the last time you made a choice based purely on your own preferences?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting just how completely Eleanor had subordinated her identity to Harold's comfort over the decades. She tried to think of recent decisions she had made without considering Harold's likely reaction, without automatically choosing the path of least resistance. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I think I've been operating on autopilot for so long that I've forgotten how to consult my own desires. Even coming here today, I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave Harold or if I just couldn't stand to stay anymore." Margaret stood up and walked to her easel, where an unfinished painting showed a woman standing at a crossroads, paths stretching in multiple directions under a sky full of possibilities. "Those might be the same thing," Margaret said. "Sometimes we don't leave because we know exactly where we're going. We leave because we finally understand that staying will kill something essential in us." Eleanor joined Margaret in front of the painting, studying the figure at the crossroads. The woman's face was turned away from the viewer, but her posture suggested determination rather than confusion, as if she understood that any path forward was better than remaining frozen in place. "Is this how you felt after Frank died?" Eleanor asked. Margaret picked up a brush and added a small detail to the sky, a hint of sunrise breaking through clouds that suggested hope rather than uncertainty. "Not immediately," Margaret said. "At first I felt lost and panicked, but gradually I realized that Frank's death had given me something I'd never had as an adult: permission to make choices based solely on what I wanted. I didn't have to consider his preferences or anticipate his criticism or modify my plans to accommodate his schedule." Eleanor understood the appeal of such freedom, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. For 45 years, she had defined herself in relation to Harold's needs and expectations. Without that framework, she wasn't entirely sure who she was or what she wanted. Over the following days, Eleanor began the slow process of rediscovering herself. Margaret's house operated on a different rhythm than the one Eleanor had known. For decades, there were no fixed meal times, no mandatory activities, no schedule beyond what felt natural and necessary. Eleanor could wake up when her body felt rested, eat when she was hungry, spend her time however seemed most appealing. The adjustment was more difficult than she had expected. On her third morning at Margaret's, Eleanor woke up at her usual 6:30 and lay in bed wondering what she was supposed to do with the day. At home, her mornings had been structured around Harold's routine. Coffee ready by 7, breakfast prepared according to his preferences, newspaper delivered to his chair, kitchen cleaned before he left for his morning walk. Here, she had no one to serve, no schedule to maintain, no external structure to organize her hours. The absence of obligation felt both liberating and disorienting. Eleanor found herself making lists of tasks that needed completion, then realizing that none of them were actually urgent or necessary. She could leave the bed unmade if she wanted to. She could eat cereal for breakfast instead of cooking eggs. She could spend the entire morning reading if that was how she chose to use her time. Margaret, observing Eleanor's struggle with unstructured time, made gentle suggestions rather than imposing activities. She invited Eleanor to join her for morning walks through the neighborhood, introduced her to the proprietor of a small bookstore that specialized in works by local authors, showed her the community garden where retired residents grew vegetables and flowers in shared plots. "The key," Margaret explained as they wandered through the garden on a particularly warm afternoon in November, "is to start small. Don't try to figure out your entire life at once. Just ask yourself what sounds appealing right now, today, this moment." Eleanor knelt beside a bed of late-season herbs, breathing in the sharp scent of rosemary and thyme. She had always enjoyed gardening, but had gradually limited herself to plants that Harold considered practical or aesthetically acceptable. Here, surrounded by experimental plantings and creative combinations, she remembered the joy of growing things simply because they were beautiful or interesting. "I'd like to try growing herbs," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the declaration. "Not just the basic ones like parsley and basil, but unusual varieties, things that might smell wonderful or have interesting flavors." Margaret smiled, clearly pleased that Eleanor was beginning to express preferences rather than simply avoiding Harold's disapproval. "Mrs. Chen, who manages this garden, is an expert on culinary herbs," Margaret said. "She might let you work with her on the herb sections. It's a good way to learn without committing to your own garden space right away." Eleanor spent the remainder of the afternoon talking with Mrs. Chen, a retired botany professor who had traveled extensively and collected seeds from herbs used in cuisines around the world. Mrs. Chen's enthusiasm was infectious, and Eleanor found herself taking notes on growing conditions and harvest techniques for plants she had never heard of before. For the first time in months, Eleanor lost track of time completely. She didn't think about what Harold might be doing or whether she should be preparing dinner or managing household tasks. She was entirely present in the moment, absorbed in learning about something that captured her imagination. When Margaret finally found her to suggest heading home for dinner, Eleanor realized it was nearly 7 o'clock. At home, Harold would have been complaining about the delayed meal, wondering aloud why simple tasks seemed to take Eleanor longer than they should. Here, Margaret simply suggested they stop for takeout from a Thai restaurant Eleanor had always wanted to try, but which Harold had dismissed as too exotic. The food was delicious, complex flavors that reminded Eleanor of her college years when she had been adventurous about trying new cuisines. She and Margaret ate directly from the containers while sitting on Margaret's back porch, watching the sun set through the trees and talking about their childhood memories of their grandmother's herb garden. Grandmother always said that herbs were like people, Eleanor remembered. Each one had its own personality and preferred growing conditions, but they were all more interesting when grown together rather than in isolation. Margaret laughed. She was probably talking about more than gardening. Grandmother never did. Approve of women who define themselves entirely through their husbands' identities. Eleanor had been too young to fully understand their grandmother's gentle rebellion against traditional domestic roles, but she was beginning to appreciate the older woman's wisdom. Their grandmother had maintained her own interests and friendships throughout her marriage, had continued painting and reading and traveling, even when such activities were considered unusual for women of her generation. "She used to tell me that marriage should add to your life, not replace it," Eleanor said. "I don't think I understood what she meant until now." That evening, Eleanor called her children for the first time since leaving Harold. She had been dreading the conversations, uncertain how to explain her decision without seeming to criticize their father or asking them to choose sides in a conflict they hadn't witnessed directly. Michael answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the distracted tone that suggested he was multitasking during their call. Eleanor could hear children's voices in the background, and the sounds of a busy household preparing for evening. Routines. "Mom, Dad said you were visiting Aunt Margaret. How long are you planning to stay?" Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself for a conversation she wasn't sure she was ready to have. "I'm not certain yet," she said. "I'm taking some time to think about what I want the rest of my life to look like." Michael's silence stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the call had been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of concern she rarely heard from her pragmatic oldest child. "Is everything okay between you and Dad? He seemed a little confused when he called yesterday. Said you'd had some kind of disagreement about household arrangements." Eleanor almost smiled at Harold's characterization of their marital crisis as a disagreement about household arrangements. Even in crisis, Harold couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the emotional dimensions of their conflict. "We've been having some difficulties," Eleanor said carefully. "Nothing dramatic or sudden, just a growing recognition that we want different things from our marriage." Michael cleared his throat in a way that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of Harold. "Mom, you know that all marriages go through rough patches, especially after so many years. Maybe you and Dad could see a counselor, or take a trip together. Sometimes a change of scenery helps couples reconnect." Eleanor appreciated Michael's concern, but she could hear Harold's influence in his suggestion that the problem could be solved through professional intervention or temporary distraction. Michael had inherited his father's tendency to view emotional conflicts as practical problems requiring logical solutions. "Michael," Eleanor said gently, "I love you, and I appreciate your concern. But this isn't something that can be fixed with counseling or vacation planning. Your father and I have grown into incompatible people over the years, and I need to decide whether I want to spend my remaining years pretending that incompatibility doesn't matter." Michael's response was immediate and predictable. "You're talking about divorce? Mom, you're in your 70s. People don't start over at your age." Eleanor felt a familiar flash of irritation at the assumption that age automatically limited her options. Everyone seemed convinced that elderly people should be grateful for whatever companionship they could find, regardless of its quality or emotional sustainability. "Maybe they should," Eleanor said. "Maybe people of all ages deserve to be in relationships that bring out the best in them, rather than requiring them to shrink themselves to fit." The conversation with Michael ended awkwardly, with promises to stay in touch and vague suggestions that time would provide clarity about the best path forward. Eleanor could tell that Michael was already planning to call Harold, probably to suggest strategies for convincing Eleanor to return home before she did something they would all regret. Her conversation with Sarah was different, but no less challenging. Sarah, who had divorced her own husband 3 years earlier, was more sympathetic to Eleanor's position, but also more direct in her questions. "Mom, have you thought about the practical implications of leaving Dad?" Sarah asked. "Do you have your own credit cards? Do you know how to manage the finances? Do you have somewhere to live long term?" Eleanor realized that Sarah was asking the questions she should have been asking herself, practical considerations that her emotional turmoil had pushed to the background. She had focused so intently on escaping her marriage that she hadn't fully considered the logistics of building an independent life. "I have some savings in my own name," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure how much money was actually available to her. "And I assume I would be entitled to half of our joint assets if we divorced." Sarah's sigh was audible over the phone. "Mom, you need to talk to a lawyer before you make any permanent decisions. I'm not saying you should stay with Dad if you're unhappy, but you need to understand your legal and financial position before you commit to anything irreversible." After hanging up with Sarah, Eleanor sat in Margaret's kitchen feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what she had started. She had been thinking of her departure from Harold as an emotional declaration of independence. But Sarah was right that it also had legal and financial implications she hadn't considered. Margaret found her staring at a legal pad where she had been trying to list everything she needed to research and understand. Second thoughts? Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from Eleanor with 2 cups of evening tea. Not about leaving, Eleanor said, but about how naive I've been. About the practical aspects. I don't even know how much money we have in our checking account, let alone how our retirement investments are structured or whether I would be able to afford to live independently. Margaret nodded understandingly. Frank handled all our finances, too. After he died, I discovered that I didn't know basic information about our own financial situation. It took months to sort everything out, and I realized how vulnerable I had been without understanding our assets and obligations. Eleanor felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had been so focused on escaping Harold's emotional control that she hadn't considered how financially dependent she had become over the decades. She had never questioned Harold's management of their money, had trusted his assurances that their retirement savings were adequate and their financial future secure. What if I can't afford to live alone? Eleanor asked. What if Harold has been supporting me all these years and I just didn't realize it? Margaret reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. Then you'll figure out how to change that situation. But don't assume the worst before you have actual information. You might discover that you're in a much stronger financial position than you realize. The next morning, Eleanor made an appointment with Sarah's divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Morrison, who specialized in representing older clients navigating late-life divorces. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, which gave Eleanor time to gather financial documents and begin the process of understanding her legal position. Margaret drove Eleanor back to the house on Maple Street on a Thursday afternoon, when Harold was at his weekly golf game. Eleanor felt strange walking through the front door with a key, like a burglar who happened to have legal access to the property she was invading. The house looked exactly as she had left it 6 days earlier, except for a thin layer of dust on surfaces she usually cleaned daily and a stack of dishes in the sink that Harold had apparently been too proud to wash by hand when the dishwasher became full. Eleanor felt a moment of satisfaction realizing that Harold's helplessness with basic household tasks was more extensive than she had realized. She gathered financial documents from Harold's meticulously organized filing system, surprised to discover how much information she had access to but had never bothered to examine. Bank statements, investment reports, insurance policies, tax returns, a complete financial portrait of their marriage that Harold had managed but never hidden from her. As Eleanor photocopied documents and organized papers into folders, she began to understand that their financial situation was more stable than she had feared. Harold had been conservative with their investments and thorough in his planning, creating a retirement portfolio that could comfortably support 2 people living modestly or 1 person living quite well. Eleanor also discovered information that surprised her. Harold had been contributing to a retirement account in her name for years, an account she had forgotten existed. The balance was substantial enough to provide her with independent income if she chose to claim it. She also found documentation showing that she was listed as the beneficiary on Harold's life insurance policies and that their house was owned jointly, meaning she had legal claim to half its value. The knowledge was empowering and unsettling, in equal measure. Eleanor realized that her fears about financial vulnerability had been largely unfounded, that Harold's years of careful money management had actually created a situation where she could afford to leave him if she chose to. She wondered if Harold understood the implications of their financial arrangements, if he realized that his practical approach to marriage had inadvertently given her the resources to escape it. Eleanor was loading the last of the documents into her car when Harold's sedan pulled into the driveway. She hadn't expected him back from golf so early and felt caught in an act that wasn't quite legal but still felt illicit. Harold got out of his car slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as they always were after 18 holes of walking. He looked older than Eleanor remembered, more fragile somehow, and she felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy, if it hadn't been mixed with 45 years of accumulated resentment. "Eleanor," Harold said, his voice carefully neutral. "I saw Margaret's car. I wasn't sure if you were back to stay or just visiting." Eleanor straightened up from loading her car, noting that Harold maintained physical distance between them, as if unsure of the social protocols for encountering a wife who had left him. "I came to get some papers," Eleanor said. "Financial records. I need to understand our situation before I make any permanent decisions." Harold's expression shifted to the concerned confusion he typically displayed when confronted with Eleanor's attempts at independence. "What kind of decisions? Eleanor, if this is about money, you know I've always taken care of our finances responsibly. You don't need to worry about that." Eleanor studied Harold's face, seeing genuine bewilderment in his eyes. He truly didn't understand that her departure had been about emotional rather than financial concerns, that her desire for independence went beyond wanting control over their bank accounts. "Harold," Eleanor said gently, "this isn't about money. This is about the fact that you told me I ruined your life, then proposed that we live as roommates because you found that more tolerable than divorce. I'm trying to understand what options I have besides accepting your assessment of our marriage." Harold shifted uncomfortably, his golf bag heavy on his shoulder. "I think I may have been too harsh that morning. We could try counseling, maybe take a vacation together. People our age work things out, Eleanor. They don't just give up." Eleanor felt a familiar tug of guilt at Harold's suggestion that she was giving up rather than fighting for their marriage. For 45 years, she had been the one fighting for their relationship, making compromises and accommodations and excuses for Harold's increasing emotional distance. The idea that she was abandoning their marriage now was both ironic and infuriating. "Harold," Eleanor said, "I spent decades trying to work things out. I tried talking to you about my feelings, suggesting activities we could share, asking for more attention and affection. You dismissed every attempt I made to improve our relationship. Now that I've stopped trying to fix what you broke, you want to suggest counseling?" Harold's face flushed slightly. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Eleanor couldn't tell. "I never broke anything. Our marriage was fine until you started getting these ideas about independence and adventure. We had a good life together, Eleanor, stable and comfortable and predictable." Eleanor closed her car door and faced Harold, directly, feeling something shift inside her as she prepared to say words she had been thinking for years, but had never been brave enough to speak aloud. "Our marriage was fine for you, Harold, because I did all the adapting. I made myself smaller and quieter and more convenient until I fit perfectly into the life you wanted to live. But I was disappearing piece by piece, and you never noticed because my disappearance made your life easier." Harold stared at Eleanor as if she were speaking a foreign language, his expression suggesting that her words made no sense within his understanding of how marriage was supposed to work. "I don't understand what you want from me," Harold said. "Finally, I've been a good husband. I've provided for you. I've been faithful. I've never been cruel or abusive. What more could you reasonably expect after 45 years?" Eleanor felt a profound sadness wash over her as she realized that Harold was genuinely confused by her expectations, that his understanding of marriage was so limited that he couldn't imagine what she might be missing. "I wanted to be loved, Harold, not just tolerated or provided for, but actually cherished as a person. I wanted my opinions to matter to you, my feelings to be important, my dreams to be worth considering. I wanted to be your partner, not just your domestic staff." Harold's silence stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if he was trying to remember instances when he had treated her the way she was describing, or if he was simply trying to understand why such treatment would be necessary. "I think you're being unrealistic about what marriage looks like at our age," Harold said finally. "Romance is for young people. Mature couples focus on practical considerations and companionship." Eleanor nodded, recognizing that this conversation was ending exactly where it had begun months earlier, with Harold unable or unwilling to understand that his version of mature marriage felt like emotional death to Eleanor. "You're probably right," Eleanor said. Your vision of marriage probably is realistic for many couples our age, but it's not what I want for whatever years I have left." Eleanor got into Margaret's car without saying goodbye, leaving Harold standing in their driveway, holding his golf bag and looking confused by the turn his comfortable life had taken. As she drove away from the house where she had spent most of her adult life, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years, as if she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying so long she had forgotten its weight. That evening, Eleanor called Patricia Morrison's office and confirmed her appointment for the following Tuesday. She was ready to understand her options, ready to discover what independence might actually look like in practical terms. For the first time since leaving Harold, Eleanor felt hopeful rather than simply desperate. She was 72 years old, but she was finally ready to find out who Eleanor Whitmore could become when she stopped trying to be the woman Harold wanted her to be. Eleanor sat in Patricia Morrison's law office on a gray December morning, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to information that was reshaping her understanding of her own life. The attorney, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than Eleanor with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had spent the past hour reviewing the financial documents Eleanor had gathered from the house on Maple Street. "Mrs. Whitmore," Patricia said, removing her reading glasses and setting aside the last of the bank statements, "I have to tell you that you're in a much stronger financial position than most women your age who are considering divorce. Your husband has actually been quite generous in ensuring your financial security, whether he intended to facilitate your independence or not." Eleanor absorbed this information with a mixture of relief and irony. Harold's careful financial planning, motivated by his desire for security and control, had inadvertently given her the resources to escape the marriage he had assumed she would never leave. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Eleanor asked. "If I were to file for divorce, what could I expect?" Patricia consulted her notes, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had guided many women through similar transitions. "Given the length of your marriage and the fact that most assets appear to be jointly held, you would likely be entitled to 50% of all marital property. That includes the house, retirement accounts, investments, and savings. Based on what I see here, that would provide you with enough income to live quite comfortably independently." Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The fear of financial destitution had been lurking beneath her other concerns, whispering that she was too old and too inexperienced to survive on her own. Now that fear was revealed as largely unfounded. "There's something else you should know," Patricia continued, leaning forward slightly. "In cases where one spouse has been financially dependent on the other for an extended period, the court sometimes awards additional support to ensure both parties can maintain a reasonable standard of living. Given your age and the fact that you've been out of the workforce for decades, you might be entitled to spousal maintenance as well." Eleanor left the law office feeling both empowered and overwhelmed. She had sought legal counsel primarily to understand her options, not necessarily to begin divorce proceedings immediately. But Patricia's assessment had made clear that divorce was not only possible, but potentially advantageous from a financial standpoint. As she drove back to Margaret's house, Eleanor found herself thinking not about money or legal strategies, but about a conversation she had overheard between Harold and his brother Thomas 3 months earlier. She had been in the garden, deadheading roses near the dining room window, when their voices had carried through the screen. "You're lucky Eleanor never got ambitious," Thomas had said. "My Janet went through a phase in her 50s where she wanted to go back to school, maybe get a real estate license. Cost me a fortune and disrupted the whole household routine." Harold had laughed in response. "Eleanor's too practical for that nonsense. She understands that her job is making our lives run smoothly. Some women never figure out that fighting. Their natural role just makes everyone miserable." At the time, Eleanor had felt a complex mixture of pride and resentment at Harold's assessment. Part of her had been pleased that he viewed her as practical and reliable, qualities she valued in herself. But another part had been stung by his dismissive attitude toward women who pursued their own ambitions. His assumption that a wife's primary function was facilitating her husband's comfort. Now, remembering that conversation in light of what she had learned from Patricia Morrison, Eleanor felt something approaching anger for the first time since leaving Harold. He had benefited enormously from her practical approach to marriage, had built his comfortable retirement on the foundation of her unpaid labor and emotional sacrifice. Meanwhile, he had accumulated enough assets to ensure his own security, while apparently never considering that Eleanor might want or deserve financial independence. That evening, Margaret found Eleanor sitting in the art studio with a blank journal open in her lap, staring out at the winter garden where bare branches caught the last light of the short December day. "How did the meeting with the attorney go?" Margaret asked, settling into her painting chair with a cup of tea steaming in the cold air. Eleanor looked up from her journal, realizing she had been lost in thought for nearly an hour without writing a single word. "Better than I expected," Eleanor said. "It turns out I'm not nearly as financially vulnerable as I thought. Harold's conservative investment strategy has actually created enough assets to support both of us comfortably if we lived separately." Margaret smiled with genuine pleasure at this news. "That must be a relief. I remember how terrified I was after Frank died, thinking I would end up in some depressing senior facility because I couldn't afford to maintain our house." Eleanor nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "The relief is definitely there, but it's mixed with something else. Something that feels like anger, which surprises me. I didn't think I was angry at Harold anymore." Margaret set down her tea and gave Eleanor her full attention. "What kind of anger?" Eleanor struggled to articulate feelings she was still trying to understand. "I think I'm angry that Harold created a financial situation that could have supported my independence years ago, but he never told me that. He let me believe I was completely dependent on him, that leaving would mean poverty and instability. Whether he did it consciously or not, he used my fear of financial ruin to keep me trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit." Margaret was quiet for a moment, apparently considering the implications of what Eleanor had realized. "Do you think he knew? That he was deliberately keeping you in the dark about your financial security?" Eleanor had been asking herself the same question since leaving Patricia Morrison's office. Harold's management of their finances had always been presented as protection rather than control, his way of shielding her from boring details and complex decisions. But the effect had been to keep Eleanor ignorant of her own resources and options. "I don't know if it was deliberate," Eleanor said slowly, "but I know it was convenient for him. As long as I believed I couldn't afford to leave, I would continue, making his life comfortable no matter how miserable I became." Eleanor spent the rest of the evening writing in her journal, not the careful documentation of daily disappointments that had characterized her earlier entries, but a more analytical examination of the patterns that had defined her marriage. She wrote about the gradual erosion of her financial literacy, the way Harold had assumed responsibility for all money-related decisions while positioning this control as chivalrous protection rather than strategic manipulation. She also wrote about the conversation she would need to have with Harold, the one where she would reveal what she had learned and make her intentions clear. Eleanor had been avoiding direct confrontation since leaving, had allowed Harold to assume that her departure was temporary and emotional rather than permanent and practical. It was time for complete honesty. 3 days later, Eleanor called Harold and asked him to meet her for lunch at the small cafe near the library where she had been spending her mornings. She chose a public place deliberately, wanting the constraint of social expectations to keep their conversations civil and focused. Harold arrived precisely on time, dressed in the brown corduroy jacket Eleanor had given him for Christmas 3 years earlier. He looked nervous in a way she rarely saw, his usual confidence replaced by the uncertainty of a man operating without a familiar script. "Eleanor," he said, settling into the chair across from her with careful formality. "You look well. Margaret's been taking good care of you, I assume." Eleanor studied Harold's face, noting the lines of tension around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his water glass. He had lost weight in the 3 weeks since she left, and his hair looked unkempt in a way that suggested he had been cutting it himself rather than visiting his regular barber. "I've been taking care of myself, actually," Eleanor said, "which is something I should have learned to do years ago." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly hoping this conversation would focus on practical arrangements for her return, rather than philosophical discussions about independence and self-sufficiency. "I've missed you," Harold said, the words sounding rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "The house feels empty without you. I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to feel valued and appreciated. Maybe I could try harder to show my gratitude for everything you do." Eleanor felt a familiar tug of sympathy for Harold's obvious discomfort, but she recognized it now as the emotional manipulation that had kept her trapped in unsatisfying patterns for decades. Harold was offering minor adjustments to his behavior, rather than fundamental changes to their relationship dynamic. "Harold," Eleanor said gently, "I've seen a lawyer. I know about our financial situation now. I know that I have options you never told me about." Harold's expression shifted immediately, from nervous hope to defensive alarm. "You've been discussing our private business with strangers? Eleanor, that's completely unnecessary. Whatever concerns you have about money, we can address them ourselves." Eleanor had expected this response, Harold's instinctive move to regain control by dismissing her right to seek independent information about their shared finances. "I had every right to understand our financial situation," Eleanor said calmly. "And I discovered that you've been managing our money in ways that could have supported my independence for years. Did you know that the retirement account in my name has enough money to provide me with a comfortable income if I chose to claim it?" Harold's silence was answer enough. Of course he had known. He had been making contributions to that account. For years had been required to provide Eleanor with annual statements that she had never bothered to read carefully. "I also discovered that I'm entitled to half of all our marital assets if we divorce," Eleanor continued, "including the house, which is apparently worth quite a bit more than I realized. I wouldn't be financially vulnerable if I left our marriage. Permanently, Harold. In fact, I might be better off." Harold's face had gone pale during Eleanor's recitation of financial facts, and she could see him calculating the implications of what she had learned. His comfortable retirement, built on the assumption that Eleanor would continue providing unpaid domestic and emotional labor, was suddenly threatened by her newfound awareness of her own economic power. "Eleanor?" Harold said, his voice carrying a note of desperation she had never heard before. "You can't be serious about divorce. After 45 years over some temporary marital difficulties that could be resolved with a little effort on both sides." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying Harold with the detached interest of someone observing a fascinating but ultimately irrelevant phenomenon. "Harold," she said, 3 months ago you told me I had ruined your life and proposed that we live as roommates because you found our romantic relationship unbearable. Now that you understand I have the financial resources to leave permanently, you want to characterize our fundamental incompatibility as temporary difficulties. Which version of your feelings should I believe?" Harold's struggle to formulate a response was painful to watch. Eleanor could see him trying to reconcile his genuine desire to end their romantic relationship with his practical need for her domestic services and companionship. "I may have been too harsh in how I expressed my feelings," Harold said finally. "Marriage after 45 years isn't about romance anyway. It's about companionship and shared history and practical support. We could find a way to be happy together if you would stop expecting something that doesn't exist at our age." Eleanor felt a moment of clarity that was almost physical in its intensity, like stepping out of a dim room into bright sunlight. Harold was asking her to accept a marriage based on his comfort and convenience while requiring her to abandon any hope of emotional fulfillment or personal growth. He was proposing that she sacrifice her remaining years to maintain his preferred lifestyle. "No, Harold," Eleanor said, her voice steady and final. "I won't stop expecting love and respect and consideration. I won't accept a marriage where only your needs and preferences matter. And I won't spend my remaining years making your life comfortable while my own spirit dies of neglect." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope she had prepared that morning. Inside were copies of the financial documents she had gathered, along with a letter outlining her intention to file for divorce if they couldn't reach an amicable separation agreement. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," Eleanor said, placing the envelope on the table between them. "I'm doing this because I finally understand that I deserve better than tolerance from the person who is supposed to love me most." Harold stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous, making no move to pick it up or examine its contents. "What about our children?" Harold asked. "What about our grandchildren? They'll be devastated by a divorce in the family." Eleanor had expected this appeal to family loyalty, Harold's attempt to use their children's potential disapproval as leverage to convince her to return. "Our children are adults with their own lives and marriages," Eleanor said. "They'll adjust to whatever decisions we make about our relationship. And honestly, Harold, staying in a loveless marriage for the sake of appearances won't benefit anyone, including our grandchildren." Eleanor stood up from the table, leaving money for her untouched lunch beside the envelope that contained the terms of her liberation. "I'll be staying with Margaret indefinitely," she said. "When you're ready to discuss practical arrangements for our separation, you can reach me there. If you prefer to handle this through lawyers, that's fine too." Eleanor walked out of the cafe without looking back, leaving Harold alone with the documents that would force him to confront the reality of life without her unpaid labor and unconditional accommodation. As she drove back to Margaret's house, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion, as if she had finally spoken words that had been trying to escape for decades. That evening, Eleanor called both of her children to inform them of her decision to pursue divorce. The conversations were difficult but necessary, and Eleanor was surprised to find that both Michael and Sarah were more understanding than she had expected. "Mom," Sarah said, "I've been thinking about what you said the last time we talked, about deserving to be in a relationship that brings out the best in you. After my own divorce, I realized how much energy I had been putting into trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken. Even Michael, after initial protests about the wisdom of divorce at their age, admitted that he had noticed the tension between his parents during recent family visits. I just want you to be happy, Mom, Michael said. And if staying married to Dad isn't making you happy, then maybe you're right to try something different." 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the kitchen of her new apartment, a bright 2-bedroom space in a complex designed for active seniors. Morning light streamed through windows that faced east toward the mountains, illuminating the small herb garden she had planted on her balcony. The apartment was furnished with pieces she had chosen for beauty rather than practicality, decorated in colors Harold had always claimed were too bold or feminine. Eleanor poured herself a second cup of coffee, something she did every morning, now without worrying about appearing jittery or undisciplined. She had signed up for watercolor classes at the community center, had joined a book club that met monthly to discuss contemporary fiction, had even planned a 2-week trip to Italy for the following spring. The divorce had been finalized with minimal drama, Harold ultimately accepting a settlement that divided their assets equally and provided Eleanor with enough income to live comfortably while pursuing interests she had deferred for decades. Harold had moved to a smaller house near his brother Thomas, where he could maintain his routine of golf and conservative politics without the burden of considering anyone else's preferences. Eleanor picked up her journal, no longer a record of accumulated disappointments, but a place to plan adventures and document discoveries. Today, she was meeting Mrs. Chen at the community garden to help plant a new section devoted to herbs used in traditional Chinese medicine. Tomorrow, she had lunch plans with a woman named Dorothy, whom she had met in her painting class, someone who shared Eleanor's love of travel and had suggested they might plan future trips together. At 73, Eleanor Whitmore had finally learned to take up space in her own life, to value her own happiness as much as she had always valued everyone else's comfort. She thought sometimes about Harold and whether he had found contentment in his simplified domestic arrangements. But mostly she thought about the future and all the experiences that were still waiting for her to discover them. Eleanor opened her journal to a fresh page and began writing. Today marks 6 months since I chose myself over security, possibility over predictability, growth over comfort. Harold was wrong about many things, but he was right about one. At our age, romance might be for young people, but adventure, curiosity, friendship, and joy belong to anyone brave enough to claim them. Outside her window, the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, illuminating a world full of paths Eleanor had never explored, but now had the rest of her life to discover. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.